In this unit, we're looking at coming of age stories and thinking about how those stories tell the passage from childhood or adolescence into adulthood. And we can rethink those stories in terms of the aspect of theme in fiction writing. So we'll look at some stories here and rethink how coming of age becomes an important part of how the story's told, what undergirds the story. Theme itself is a larger meaning that's present within a story. It's on the level of this is the story of a child's transitions into adolescence, or an adolescent's journey into adulthood. Both those kind of express a sense of theme in the story. And some other examples of theme here include how a person can reconsider one's identity in terms of personal markers of identity, or within a larger social situation. Another example of theme is how family dynamics define us as individuals, how particular interactions within family define us. Another theme is how an individual finds a place within a larger neighborhood, city, society, or culture. An encounter with technology or magic is another kind of theme here. And you can also think about individual aspects of experience, how theme also kind of engages a sense of the meanings of faith or work or place or displacement in terms of many immigration narratives. If you're a reader of Harry Potter, you're already kind of familiar with the idea of coming of age as a theme within a larger story. The literary term here is Bildungsroman, a German word that rethinks the literary genre of coming of age, a journey or a transition from childhood to adulthood, from innocence to experience in some ways, where one becomes aware of one's identity against the surrounding culture, family, norms, etc. And if you think about the Harry Potter stories as coming of age stories, so they point to this kind of thematic reading in various ways. They are kind of a sense of a reconsideration of identity. The children's magical lives and their developing sense of their powers as wizards, a redefinition of identity here in those terms. The children in the novels also kind of define themselves against the surrounding family and society. They enter adolescence within a defined culture, and how they work both within and against the norms of adolescence, define the tensions within the Potter novels overall. There's also a sense of the jealousies and rivalries that they have, or that we also have within adolescence and the transition into adulthood. We measure ourselves against our peers, just as the children do in the Potter stories as they move from adolescence and then finally into adulthood. And there's also a sense of quest in which one is redefined and sometimes perhaps wounded or injured and marked for adulthood in the end. And those are also a part, that quest is also a part of the Potter novels. Two stories we're looking at in terms of the class are Jamaica Kincaid's Girl and Joyce Carol Oates' a story that we'll look at in just a second. Kincaid's Girl is told, first of all, in a second-person point of view. It's kind of a primer in a way, where an adult figure is addressing a more childish or adolescent you. And this is interesting in a couple ways. First of all, number one is that you as reader are kind of engaged as a character here. You are the you who's being addressed by this older adult figure. You're kind of being led in on the wisdoms of adulthood. And the question is, how do you respond against Kincaid's own you that's in the story? Also, another interesting aspect of this is how gender and sexuality play in the definition of the story. This story is called Girl, so you have an adult female addressing an adolescent female. And would this story be very different, particularly in how sexuality is addressed within it, if the story was called Boy? Here the girl is reminded, don't be a slut, over and over again. Would that be very different if the story it was addressed as Boy? And so how you yourself identify in terms of gender and sexuality might play into the ways in which you read this story, Girl. it's a primer in adulthood, and the story develops as a series of commands and defined duties. Some of these duties are just simply domestic tasks: how to cook, how to clean, how to do this, how to do that, and they're told from a kind of a within a dialectic of a commanding voice, and how that adult voice is answered by a more adolescent answering voice who butts into the conversation every once in a while. But what if, to complicate the sense of, how one becomes an adult within the culture, society. And then there's also some kind of social direction given within these commands and duties that, as the adult voice here says, this is how you smile to someone you don't like too much. And then a lot of these commands or duties take on a sexualized or gendered aspect as they develop within the story. The adult voice addresses the adolescent and says, try to walk like a lady and not like the slut you are so bent on becoming, on page 306. So there's some definite social norms being laid out within these commands and duties, and that adult voice is trying to make them very simple, but the answering voice is always trying to gather a sense of the complexity of that. You're not a boy, the adult voice reminds the you in the story. But then there's also a sense of the relationship between adult men and women here. This is how you bully a man, and this is how a man bullies you. The kind of personal politics that go on within a relationship, how that relationship defines itself, is also a part of the advice here, as if that could be so simple. And the adolescent voice wants to answer that in various points, and that kind of creates tensions in the story. You get down to the conclusion of the story, and that gendered aspect is reaffirmed, where the adult voice breaks in after the adolescent voice has tried to make things more complex, and says, you mean to say that after all you are really going to be the kind of woman who the baker won't let near the bread? And the adolescent voice here is kind of spoken down to by the adult voice. When the adolescent voice has tried to complicate things, the adult voice steps in to kind of force to try to force a simple sense of the commands here. So tensions develop within that. Is that transition from adolescence to adulthood a simple thing? No, right? That transition from adolescence to adulthood is much more complex, particularly as we try to define ourselves within the social and cultural norms and the interpersonal norms of relationships, and Kincaid's story really gets at that complexity. The second story we're looking at in this unit is Joyce Carol Oates' Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? And this is told not in second or first person, but in a close third person point of view. We get a sense of the character Connie's perspective as she's sitting at home one day, and Arnold friend and Ellie, his own friend, suddenly show up at Connie's house while she's alone. Her family's gone off to a family barbecue, and Connie's left alone to kind of face down friends' sudden advances here. There's a feel of horror to the story, and that kind of engages a sense in which, does growing up and making that move from childhood to adolescence kind of almost feel like a horror story in itself. And as you read the story, you'll note the kind of the horror conventions that start to develop within it. Connie's sense of self-definition is in the beginning of the story is that it can be defined in various ways. On 347, we become aware that Connie knew that she was pretty, and that was everything to her, right? She's always kind of, bolstering up that prettiness, right? She's always kind of primping and taking care of her, taking care of her looks throughout the beginning of the story. She's aware that everything has two sides to it, home and not home. So she's kind of defining herself in these two spaces, the home environment of family, domestic space of family, and her own kind of independence that's developing as she makes the move into adolescence and adulthood here. Part of that is marked by a sexual tension of how she defines herself against the boys here, right? That in the story in 350, all the boys fell back and dissolved into a single face, a feeling. So she's beginning to get a sense of how she can kind of control and is controlled by her relationship with the others in the story. And she hears constant music in her head. She has a sense of aloneness, but she's always hearing music here. She exists within her family's world in this way also, that she defines herself against her older sister June, who's come back to live at home and has a job and has her own kind of sense of responsibilities, but is still kind of cloistered or isolated within the family environment. Connie fights back against that environment to the point when the family goes off for the barbecue, her mother commands her, just stay at home alone then. And so she's left alone at the home. And then when Friend actually does come and starts to threaten Connie and Connie's sense of the world, Connie fights back and says, but my father's coming back, right? That sense that, she still hasn't resolved the issues, the transition from childhood into adolescence and adulthood, that she still calls for her parents and feels safe within her parents' direction and guidance. Connie's coming of age happens as Friend appears here, right? He comes out of nowhere. It begins with a gesture that she sees him downtown one night, and he wags his finger at her and says, "Gonna get you, baby." And he comes out to the house to invite Connie for a ride. She feels a sense of perpetual music behind him, and he tells her, "I'm your lover, honey. I'll come inside where it's all secret," on page 359. And then things start to take a more kind of ominous turn, right? He speaks of the place being lit up with a fire, that sense of passionate fire, perhaps here. And in the end, he tells her, it's all over for you here, that sense of family or domestic space. The place where you came from ain't there no more, ain't there anymore. And so Friend welcomes her into adulthood at this point. You can read this story also as a kind of horror story here, right? That adolescence itself becomes a horror. You can read Friend as a kind of infernal or devilish figure, and the tensions that exist in the shrinking sense of distance between Friend and Connie, right? She feels that distance shrinking. There's an overt horror in a moment when Ellie, Arnold's friend, says, "Do you want me to go and pull that telephone out?" Which would sever Connie's connection to the world, and she feels that as a real sense of horror. And then there's the resolution of the story where Connie opens that screen door and then goes into the land behind Friend, that she steps into that world of adulthood. So these two stories, you can take a look at them and kind of think about how coming of age is a central theme within the stories and how these relate a sense of transition from childhood to adolescence and adulthood. Thanks.